when we talk about love, particularly, for the lack of a better word, I know it sounds a bit cheesy, but romantic love. That first and foremost, obviously, the Islamic perspective is that that type of love is meant to occur between a man and a woman. Now, this isn't the topic in the session for this lecture because I think that this is such a huge issue for everybody today that I think it deserves a discussion in and of itself, and maybe we'll have, there we go, another teaser. We'll talk about this in a future session, but the issue of homosexuality is a really, common discussion. It's a commonplace conversation that's happening all across society today. And there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of specific points that need to be made about the topic of homosexuality. I'm just going to give you a few basic things that, number one, obviously, we don't dehumanize anyone. Islam is not in the business. It is a religion. It does have a code of law. It does have rules and restrictions and guidelines and recommendations and prohibitions, impermissibilities. Absolutely. As any way of life would. But it does not allow for the dehumanization of any segment of the population. None whatsoever. Even in Christian teachings, they talk about hate the sin but not the sinner. And so Islam operates along those same lines, that even though something might not be permissible from an Islamic perspective, it does not allow, let alone the religion doing it itself, it does not allow for the dehumanization of anybody, regardless of what their practice or perspective may be. But just from a legal perspective, a doctrinal perspective, homosexuality is not, same gender romantic relationships are not deemed permissible within the religion of Islam. It does not deem it permissible. Having said that, so we know that this occurs between a man and a woman. Then further, the fulfillment of that relationship and the maturation and development of that relationship necessitates, requires, mandates marriage. And so that's the baseline of our discussion today. That marriage is the only way to really live out and fulfill this relationship. Now, let's talk about how to work towards marriage. First and foremost, what is the prospect of marriage? The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, has a really phenomenal hadith narration. I should actually start with the Quran. Marriage is something that is part of the miracle of God. It's a manifestation of God's blessings and God's miracles on this earth. وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُم مَّوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. That it is from the miraculous signs of God that He's created a soulmate, a spouse for you. That you're able to find comfort, solace, peace, and tranquility through that person, with that person. And He puts love and affection between the two of you. So this is what the Quran says, هُنَّ لِبَاسٌ لَكُمْ وَأَنْتُمْ لِبَاسٌ لَهُنَّ. You are an outer garment for them and they are an outer garment for you. You support one another, you protect one another, you care for one another, you're there for one another. So it's a very emotional perspective on marriage. What a lot of times people would not expect, that in scripture, you'd expect something very rigid, very precisely defined, but it gives a very emotional definition to what marriage is. Then secondly, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has a very beautiful tradition narration where he talks about how whenever anyone gets married, they get married for one of four different reasons. Typically, people marry for either physical attraction, لِجَمَالِهَا, for beauty, for physical attraction. Number two, the second, motivating factor in considering someone for marriage is وَلِحَسَبِهَا, for somebody's background. Typically, this word is defined as family. I prefer to define this as somebody's background, somebody's experiences, where somebody's coming from. Because family is a part of that, but there's a lot more that contributes to that. So where is somebody coming from, kind of in life? Number three is walimaliha. And that literally defines as, a lot of times people mistranslate it. They too narrowly define it as for money. But it's not just even money or not even financial status. It more so talks about like people's careers. A lot of times career and career choices, right, are a motivating factor. And fourthly and finally, it talks about walidiniha, from the spiritual perspective. A lot of times the motivations are spiritual. And then the Prophet ﷺ says something very interesting. He says, فَضْفَرْ بِذَاتِ الدِّينِ, that let the distinguishing criteria be spirituality and religion. Now, I'd like to talk to you all about how this is, what's the understanding of this, what this teaches us, but then how this is also misunderstood. What this is telling us is that these are the motivating factors of why people get married, and of course the deal breaker, the defining factor, is spirituality. However, this is misapplied and mistranslated and misinterpreted as some people understand it to mean none of the three other factors should be a consideration at all. Like somehow it's negating this fourth and final one, and the Prophet giving it preference somehow negates the previous three. If you pay very close attention to the language, and the students are here, do you hear, calling on y'all in the back hiding, do you hear any type of nafi or nahi or negation of any manner? No, there's none whatsoever. He said these are the reasons why people get married. Fadfar. Dhafara in the Arabic language means for something to rise above. Let that rise above out of everything else, but he did not negate the presence of those other factors. Which means you absolutely take them into consideration. There's nothing wrong with taking those into consideration. So one of the primary points that I wanted to make here today is that there's other traditions and narrations in the classical, works of the Muslims where they've discussed a lot of this material. It talks about the issue of kafa'a, al-kufu, which means compatibility. Compatibility is key. That's a primary consideration for marriage according to Islam. And these are 4 types of compatibility it talks about. Number 1 is having compatibility in terms of like physical attraction. That's an absolute necessity. That's an absolute necessity. This is and again, that doesn't mean that we define beauty based on how society defines it. I think we're all intelligent. I mean, this is an intellectual academic institution. I think everybody here understands that that's not a standard for anybody, aside from somebody who doesn't live in the real world. That's all fake. It's phony. I think we all grasp that. We all understand that. But it's a personal perspective there, at the very least, that compatibility, that physical compatibility, attraction needs to be there. Number 2 is that it talks about a compatibility in terms of emotional and intellectual compatibility. That's what background is, right? Where you're coming from. That's emotional compatibility. You understand one another. You can relate to one another. You can empathize with one another. The third thing is, intellectual compatibility. What are your interests? What intellectually stimulates you? What are you fascinated by? What is intriguing to you? What are you engaged in within your life? What are your passions? What are your interests? And then fourthly and finally, and this is the most important, so last but not least, I'm mentioning this last, but that should not take away from the importance of it, is spiritual compatibility. And this answers that question that a lot of young people have. And when initially a lot of times we hear about it, every Muslim has the same reaction. Astaghfirullah. Right? The question about, is it permissible to marry a non-Muslim? Is it okay for a Muslim to marry a non-Muslim? The second we hear that, we're like, oh no. No, we don't even talk about that. Like if there were adults like parents here, they'd be like, why even bring that up? Right? And so people get really bent out of shape about that. But you know what the reality is? When you especially talk to people, you understand that there's a lot of struggles and there's a lot of confusion and a lot of misinformation. People are confused. You have to understand that spiritual compatibility is the most necessary. And the most basic spiritual compatibility is that you have the same beliefs. The same basic core beliefs. Not that there's not any room for interpretation or variance, absolutely. But the core beliefs have to be in line, in tune, on the same page. And then further spiritual compatibility in terms of You know, even the level of practice of the religion. What is your prioritization of your religion and your spirituality in terms of the other things in your life? We can preach what's ideal. Well, it should always be first, brother. It's not, you know, this isn't Muslim Jeopardy. You don't have to give me the correct answer. I'm talking about real stuff. I'm talking about real stuff. Is it actually first in somebody's life or not? And if you're not putting it first in your life, for you to create that as a standard of marriage and go out there and try to pursue somebody and lock them into a relationship when religion isn't a priority for you, but their spirituality is a priority for them, guess what? We have incompatibility. And it ain't gonna work. It does not work. So compatibility is extremely important. Now, a lot of times when you talk to your parents, when you talk to older folks, when you read more older classical material on Islam, when it oftentimes talks about compatibility, the most emphasized point of compatibility is what? Say it. What is it, everybody? You know what it is.
Background.
Yeah, it's religion.
Race, ethnicity, region, culture, tribe, city, neighborhood, color of skin. Oh no. Oh no, he did? Yes, I did. And it is, right? It is. That's a big concern for a lot of people. You have to understand that compatibility and its emphasis and its definition, that's the word I'm looking for. The definition of compatibility varies from time to time, from place to place. I would venture to argue that for a lot of us, and I can already tell you that I'm not quite in your generation, but for like my children, race, ethnicity is not going to be a concern of compatibility at all. At all. Not in any way, shape, or form. And that's a reality. That's a reality. Some of the forms of compatibility that a lot of times, you know, certain generations of Muslims or certain demographics or segments of the Muslim community aren't concerned about a lot because they're so obsessive about racial or ethnic compatibility that they don't think about educational compatibility at all. Level of education, like I said, spirituality, emotional compatibility. Those are the most important factors. So the first thing I wanted to touch base on, establish kind of a baseline on is who is an ideal candidate for marriage? For you, for anyone. And that is somebody of the opposite gender who is compatible with you. Now let's talk about some of the nitty-gritty of how you go about figuring that and knowing that. Well, typically just from basic interaction with the person and a person's public personality, a lot of things can be pretty well established. You at least have a general idea of who you're dealing with and who you're talking to and who you're talking about. You have a general idea from just the public, you know, appearance or public, you know, presence of somebody. So that's obviously establishes at least some level of, that kind of opens the door to the conversation. Secondly, you have to understand, and even this is not universally applicable because there are unique circumstances and situations, but generally speaking, that, you know, addressing someone, reaching out to someone, talking to someone to at least gauge a level of interest is something that there's not anything wrong with, so that, you know, you're not pursuing something that there's no point in pursuing. At least establishing, like, is there even any level of interest here? Is this a conversation that we can have? Would you be interested in having this conversation? Is there any point to me even going further with this? All right, guys? And you'll either be given a yes or you'll be shot down. And then you'll curl up in a ball and cry. All right? But either way, that's how you basically figure something out. Once you have something figured out that there's a level of compatibility here and there is interest, mutual interest, this is the part that sucks. And this is the part that's going to make me sound like I just got out of, you know, a time machine from the 1700s. But at the end of the day, you also have to understand that Islam, in a lot of areas, accommodates us and understands our circumstances. But at the same time, Islam does mandate upon us certain rules and regulations for our own good and for the well-being of greater society. And one of those rules and restrictions and regulations is, and we talked a little bit about this last time, is that after that point on, personal, intimate interaction with that person is something that's not permissible. Outside of, we talked about this on campus with the students and some conversations that we were having about communications and how to exactly handle that. Outside of a public, professional, limited conversation or interaction, it's just not permissible to pursue further personal, intimate communication. It's not healthy, it's not good, it creates unfair expectations, it confuses both sides without any realistic idea of whether this will actually come to fruition or not. And so a lot of times, and I'm even talking to practicing Muslims, right? We tend to be very judgmental about, the dating scene. And we'll roll our eyes and we'll talk bad about them and we'll talk about how haram they are and how bad they are and how much of they're shayateen and they're evil and the spawn of Satan, and we'll talk about all of this. But we ourselves are sometimes engaging in pretty much that same activity and behavior. We're having the same level of intimate conversation and interaction through some different means. We're keeping it in text message while they're doing it maybe in person at a restaurant or at the movies. It does not change the fact that we're engaging in that same type of behavior. So now this is where it comes in, to actually practically talk about the solutions. What is the outlet then? The outlet at that time is to formally propose. To actually go and make a proposal for marriage. Now that brings about a huge issue and a question. And that huge issue in question is just like that. That's kind of quick, it's kind of fast. But that's exactly it. This brings about a very important topic, and that is, we're Muslims. Faith, trust in God, is always a part of the equation. So that's where you do your due diligence. You actually figure out who you are, what type of person would be right for you, what is compatibility for you. You find somebody that you feel that you're compatible with. You reach out and talk, and figure out whether there is mutual interest. You maybe even consult with somebody that you can trust, that can keep a secret. Please don't tell your friend who's going to tell everybody. There ain't no good in that. So you'll even consult with somebody, get some advice from someone. And then what's that third step of the procedure, everyone? You pray. You pray. We call it istikhara. Istikhara, seeking good from God. I'm not going to give a whole lecture here on istikhara because that'll take up too much time. There's a video online that you can watch where I explain the whole procedure on how to do istikhara. There's even a written article where it talks about how to conduct istikhara that you'll find online. If you want to find the video, just YouTube istikhara. And my name to narrow down the search results. If you're looking for the write-up, if you'd rather read it, step by step, how to do istikhara, you'll find it on a website called muslimmatters.org. muslimmatters.org, because Muslims matter. Alright, but you'll find it on muslimmatters.org. And go there, I guarantee it won't be time wasted. Because you'll really be fascinated by this practice. If you know about it, then you already know how amazing it is. If you don't know exactly, you know a little bit about it, but you don't really know how to do it, I'm telling you, it's life-changing. It's a life-changing experience. That's when you pray on it. And that's where you find conviction. How do you know it's right though? How do you know it's right? Well, Allah puts that in your heart that this is right, this is good for me. That's called faith, that's called confidence. And that comes from Allah. But you got to pray to Him and present your situation to Him for Him to inspire that confidence within you. And then after that point, you have that faith, you have that confidence, you put your trust in Allah. That He's looking out for you, He's got your back. And that's how you take that leap and you take that step forward of actually making a formal proposal. I'm gonna switch over to like some other terminology and languages. In the Arab culture, you have something that's called like Katb al-Kitab or the Kitab, which is actually the nikah. And then after that you have the walima, the actual reception and everything. In Desi culture, all right, there is an engagement again. In case anyone's got any mystery about it, that's called the mangni, right? That's an engagement. Then you actually have, and this isn't a real prominent part of the cultural marriage, but there's an actual nikah that's actually conducted, aqdun nikah, the actual ceremony with the Maulvi Sahib, all right? So there's that actual nikah, that's the marriage ceremony, that's the actual religious ceremony, and then there's the shadi, all right, that's just like a reception, a party. There is rukhsati, which is basically referring to walima. All right, when the couple actually moves in together, they live together from that point on. Now understand this, that religious wedding ceremony, the nikah, which is called the Katb al-Kitab, which is the formal wedding ceremony with the priest, in our case that's the imam that conducts that. That is the only thing that establishes the actual relationship of husband and wife. Anything that precedes that, anything that comes before that, mangni, engagement, whatever else, the khitbah, anything else, the actual proposal, that does not establish actual marriage. It doesn't establish a relationship of husband and wife. And that means up till that point, there is that restriction on interaction. That's just a reality again. Culturally, it's difficult, especially, like again, I think with coming generations, this will be figured out and solved because we'll have to kind of establish a culture of our own. And hopefully that'll be more considerate of the actual Islamic function, the Islamic mechanisms, the religious function. But as it stands right now, a lot of times young people, when they decide they want to get married and they figure out that, okay, what actually makes interaction at a very intimate level permissible here is the actual nikah, the Katb al-Kitab. A lot of times parents, families are somewhat resistant to going straight to that step. But that's just the reality of it. So whether your parents are compliant, whether they're on board or not, whether your families are being easy or difficult to deal with, the mangni, the engagement, the khitbah will not make you husband and wife. There is no status of fiancé in the religion itself. There actually is, I shouldn't say that actually. The only significance of the khitbah, the mangni, the fiancé, the engagement status in religion is that once it has been established that an official proposal has been made and y'all are engaged, that's all that means. You've given an official proposal, now y'all are engaged, as long as that's been accepted. Y'all are engaged at this point. It's not permissible for somebody else to come in and give a proposal, and it's not permissible for you at that time to go and propose to somebody else. It's almost like a promise has been made. We're going to see this through. That's the only restriction that places. And outside of that, it does not establish marriage, it does not establish a relationship of husband and wife, and whatever restrictions are there will still be there in spite of that. And that's the basic outline, and that's the basic gist of, who to look for, what you need to figure out yourself, and how to actually technically pursue this. That's about as condensed and as short as I can make it. It might even seem a little unfulfilling, but that's the best I could summarize it in my head. As a last concluding comment, because I don't like to kind of just end on a technical note, like we ended tafsir today, remember? That was more than anticlimactic, it was almost kind of sad, but I don't want to end on that type of a note. So to put things a little bit more tangibly and to kind of create some perspective, the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam talks about how marriage is a completion of half your faith. It's a spiritual experience. We had the very amazing blessing this past week at the institute, at the seminary, in Sirah class, where we're studying the life of the Prophet Muhammad from classical sources, we read that, students, or you guys, you remember that passage that we read from Ibn Ishaq about Khadija, the wife of the Prophet, and what she meant to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, especially in terms of his mission, his message of preaching the religion of God to all of humanity. She was his friend. She was his strongest supporter. She would relieve, she would take away the burden and the weight from his shoulders. When people would reject him, when people would ridicule him, when people would mock him, when people would make fun of him, she would reaffirm him and console him to the point where he felt confident and he felt strong. And within minutes of coming home and putting his hand in her hands, he was able to leave behind and forget all the difficulty that was laid upon him. That's marriage. That's that beautiful relationship. But we have to understand, does every marriage sound like that? I mean, we live in a time where what's the divorce rate? Anybody have recent statistics? 50%. 50% divorce rate. Sounds like half the people aren't experiencing that. And you know, by the way, that something I read interesting in an article, that divorce rate, 50%, that's only the rate of divorce amongst people who are actually still getting married. But if you actually take into consideration the number of people who have just given up on the institution of marriage altogether and decided never to get married ever again, you actually find out that less than half of the people are actually going into marriage, and then half those people that go into marriage are ending up in divorce. So when you actually think about and talk about, you know, how many people are not finding fulfillment in marriage, you're talking about 75% of the population. That's a shocking, scary number. And even the Muslim community, we're not immune to this. I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, the number of divorce cases that we receive on our desks every single week, every single day. It's crazy, it's shocking. So that's not happening for everyone. You know why? I'm going to ask y'all a very simple, basic question. Maybe some of y'all don't know the answer to this, and that's okay. That's what we're here for. We're here to learn. Who can tell me, and not you guys in the back, all right? No showing off. Who's heard of the word barakah before? Raise your hand if you've heard the word barakah. What does the word barakah mean? Blessing. Anybody else? Blessing. A general translation of the word barakah is blessing. You know what barakah really is? Barakah can best be understood as two people having the same exact thing, but it being beneficial for one person and not being beneficial for the other person. The difference is barakah. Barakah is the quality. Two people can have the same exact thing. It can be a gift for one person and a curse for the other. The difference is barakah. Where does barakah come from? Who gives barakah? Can y'all tell me, please? Allah. Tabarakallah. Fatabarakallahu ahsanul khaliqin. Tabarakalladhi biyadihi al-mulk. Allah is the only one who can give barakah. We have to make sure we're good with God. We're taking care of our relationship with Allah. We're respecting Allah. And He will reward us by putting barakah in our relationships, in our marriage, in our lives. And then we'll actually get to experience the type of relationship, the type of beautiful life and marriage that people like the Prophet ﷺ and Khadija had, like Ali and Fatima had, like the countless other people throughout history have experienced. We can have that. We just got to make sure that we're good with Allah. And then He'll reward us with barakah.